Hello, and welcome to part 3 of our Building a Culture of Consent video series. Throughout this series, we have worked to show you what consent is and how you can cultivate a culture of consent within your own relationships. I'll briefly go over a roadmap for this video. In this final part, we will focus on showing you how to think about community needs and wants, and how to prevent harm in your community through a culture of upstanding and intervention strategies. Now on to our team. My name is Anna Marie Safranik. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a student staff member for the Share Education team.
Hi, my name is Grace Pungafari. I also use she, her pronouns, and I am the Assistant Director and Education Outreach Manager for the Share Education team.
In part 2 of this video series, we covered how to cultivate consent within your personal relationships. But building a comprehensive culture of consent requires intentional actions at both the personal level and the community level. So, what is community-oriented consent? Just a reminder that consent is broadly defined as a voluntary and informed agreement. When applied to a community context, this means that consent applies to communal living, establishing community norms, and forming collective agreements.
A great way to start fostering community-oriented consent is by establishing community boundaries. Boundaries are limits and rules that are set to define the bounds of interactions. When boundaries are defined, we are living in a space of choice instead of obligation. This is how we can integrate consent into our community norms. To learn more about boundaries, please watch part 1 and part 2 of this video series. It's important to reflect, develop, and affirm community boundaries, and a great way to start doing that is by thinking about the needs and wants within the context of a community. We like to frame this using a quadrant activity that you can do on your own to reflect on what your boundaries are within the context of a community. And the first quadrant is deal breaker. And what this deal breaker category can be surrounding is a question around, in your community, what are your absolutely not willing to put up with deal breakers? The second quadrant is labeled as essential. And the question that you can reflect on is, what is essential to have and expect from others for you to feel safe and supported in your community? And the third quadrant is the acceptable category. And what you are willing to accept is the central question here. And perhaps it's something that bothers you, but you are willing to let it go or address it later. Lastly, in the fourth quadrant is the bonus category. And this surrounds the question of, imagine your ideal community, what would it be like and what would it feel like?
Thinking about these questions and then discussing them within your community, whether it be your dorm, household, VSO, Greek chapter, etc., is a great way to understand your collective needs and wants, and then start establishing the community boundaries. The necessity of establishing these boundaries is even more apparent during COVID-19, when so many people are closely sharing living spaces, resources, and time. Our households have become our communities. Perhaps you're sharing an apartment with Stanford friends while you're remotely enrolled in classes, and you might be concerned that your friends are inviting too many people from outside of your pod into the apartment. Or you might be living with your family again, and you're struggling to finish classwork because now you have a lot more familial responsibilities to consider. These examples demonstrate that no matter what type of household you're in, taking the time to establish some community boundaries is a great way to clarify everyone's respective needs, wants, and concerns. Be sure to refer back to video 1 for options on the language structures you can use for these consent conversations.
We also want to take some time to discuss how identity can play out in the community boundaries. When developing and communicating boundaries, it is important to keep in mind the impact that power dynamics and cultural and institutional barriers can have. Consent is often ignored with minoritized and marginalized community members based on how people react to their identities. You have to challenge yourself and your community to act against these societal norms and oppressions so that you can meet the needs of all community members.
For example, perhaps a gender nonconforming community member wants to emphasize that having a gender-neutral bathroom in your community's shared space is essential. The community needs to make that a priority. Or perhaps a Black community member wants to make alternative emergency plans so that law enforcement isn't immediately brought into your community when there's an urgent matter. That need must be addressed. We want to encourage you to first be aware of how people's different identities and their respective intersections impact their needs and wants within the community. And second, listen to those needs and wants within the community and give them the weight and significance they deserve in order to establish boundaries that cultivate genuine consent for everyone.
Now, when working through these norms, you're likely to encounter dilemmas. Perhaps two individuals have essentials that clash with one another. To use the law enforcement example from earlier, in addition to the Black student who may not feel comfortable with the use of law enforcement due to historical and contemporary realities of police brutality and anti-Blackness, there could also be another community member who is an international student and grew up needing to rely on law enforcement to stay safe in their home country. They may indeed want to use law enforcement to be involved in if there is a crisis. These situations are really challenging and complex, and if you can't come to an agreement in this situation, then all parties will need to decide for themselves how to proceed that feels best and safe for them. Decisions could include choosing whether or not to leave, to find a different community, or choosing to be part of the same community but in a different way. Regardless of the decision, it's important to keep in mind that there are also some norms and boundaries that apply to all groups when we agree to live in a broader campus community. For example, at Stanford, all the communities are under the boundary of the fundamental standard. So in order to be at Stanford, you have to agree to uphold that as an essential boundary in your community. In summary, forming and being a part of a community means both developing and agreeing to communal boundaries and norms. Now that we've provided some ways to establish community boundaries, we want to move on to discuss how to be an upstander.
Building a culture of consent also requires a reduction in acts of harm within the community. A great way to do this is by being an upstander. In order to understand what an upstander is, think of it as a contrast to a bystander. A bystander is anyone in the community who sees or hears about a behavior that could lead to something high risk or harmful. Every bystander faces the same choice. Do I get involved and try and make things better, or do I ignore the situation? The bystander takes the latter approach and the harm continues.
However, an upstander is someone who makes the choice to intervene to try to make things better. Being an upstander means intervening in both daily acts of harm, so for example, street harassment, bullying, sexist jokes, and intervening in periodic high-risk situations, such as situations that may lead to physical violence, sexual assault, or relationship violence.
In the following section, we will just be covering an overview of intervention strategies, so we encourage you to engage with a full Upstander training to experience and practice these skills. To learn more about being an Upstander, please visit sarah.stanford.edu/upstanderlife or request an Upstander Life workshop by visiting sarah.stanford.edu/training request.
So to provide you with a short overview, we want to first provide the tangible steps that you could take when you encounter a potential act of harm. These are the 5 steps that will help you overcome the bystander effect and effectively intervene as an upstander. The first step is to first notice the situation. The second step is to interpret it as problematic. For this step, it's important to note that people are less likely to help if they perceive a person to be responsible for their own misfortune. Bias can distort our perceptions, attitudes, behaviors, attention, listening skills, and support in these situations. So be aware of how your biases could be impacting the way you notice and interpret the potentially harmful situations so that you can intervene effectively. The third step is to assume personal responsibility, followed by the fourth step, which is to know what to do, and lastly, to intervene safely. Intervening can be really difficult, but by following this process and staying educated about how to best intervene, you're taking really important steps towards reducing harm and violence in your community.
So what can you do to intervene safely? Another intervention strategy we want to introduce is the 4 Ds. The 4 Ds, which are direct, distract, delegate, and delay, is a comprehensive strategy that provides the opportunity for you as the upstander to choose the intervention option that is most accessible to you. In any given situation, you may have valid concerns that may hinder intervention. So this list provides the viable options you have while prioritizing your safety and other concerns.
The 4 Ds are defined as follows. The first one being direct. So this is regarding directly intervening in the moment to prevent a problematic situation from happening. The second one is distract, and this is regarding interrupting the situation without directly confronting the one enacting the harm. The next strategy is delegation, and this is when you can seek help from another individual. Maybe this is someone who has more social power or authority in that situation. And then lastly, the delay strategy. This can be concerning checking in with impacted parties after an incident has occurred and continuing with follow-up. The 4Ds is a great strategy to employ in order to know what will be the best course of action to take and to intervene safely. Being an upstander and learning about intervention strategies are really vital steps in reducing harm and building a culture of consent.
Now that we've outlined some ways to cultivate community-oriented consent, we invite you to discuss and create goals to cultivate community accountability that centers consent culture within your daily, monthly, and yearly rhythms of life. It's important to continually revisit this content and these strategies. Here are some questions to come back to as you work towards building a culture of consent. As a community, how do we continue to shape, uphold, and revisit our agreed community boundaries? Be as specific as possible and think about the existing structures like programs, meetings, visuals, policies and procedures, etc., that are in place and the structures that need to be in place.
Also, studies have shown that the probability of reaching long-term goals are significantly increased when we set a subsidiary goal, aka a goal that acts as a stepping stone to the long-term goal. That needs to be completed within 24 hours. So for example, if my long-term goal is to foster a caring community, my subsidiary 24-hour goal is to talk with my friend about the importance of personal and community boundaries, or to get a book on nonviolent communication to be able to give feedback to anyone that is an aggressor or responsible party in any situation after the fact. So the question that you may ask yourself is, what is my long-term goal? And what are my subsidiary goal or goals that I can do within 24 hours to step towards that main longer goal? Building a culture of consent is an ongoing process, both at the personal and community level, and it requires continual learning, reflection, and action. But watching this video series is a critical step in reducing sexual violence and promoting consent within your daily life and your community.
Thank you for watching this final part in our Building a Culture of Consent series. To continue your learning, there are a variety of Share Ed Team videos you can watch on our website or by emailing our office. You can also visit sarah.stanford.edu/learn more for more information on a variety of related topics. Lastly, if you'd like to contact our team, please email sarah@stanford.edu and we can schedule an appointment. Thank you for listening and learning.